My mother sent me a text that said we need $45,000 from your savings for your sister's wedding. Family helps family, and I read it standing in my kitchen on a Tuesday evening, and I did not respond. And I did not respond the next day either. And I did not respond for the following 6 months, and I want to tell you exactly why I went quiet, because the silence was not avoidance. It was the most deliberate decision I have made in my adult life. And by the time I finally spoke to my parents again, the conversation happened entirely on my terms, in a room I had chosen, with information they did not expect me to have. And my mother sat across from me and said, "You can't just disappear on your family." Hannah and I said, "I didn't disappear, Mom." I removed myself from a conversation I had already answered honestly, and you chose not to hear the answer. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. And if you're new here today, I think this story might resonate more than most, because it's not really about money. It's about what happens when silence becomes the only language someone will actually listen to. My name is Hannah Okafor, and I am 30 years old, and I have spent 8 years building a savings account specifically earmarked for a down payment on a house, slowly and carefully, through a financial discipline that required real sacrifice. Skipping vacations, driving an older car, living below what my income could have technically supported, and my younger sister Brianna got engaged 14 months before the wedding and roughly 4 months into the planning. My parents asked me directly for $45,000 from that savings account to help cover the wedding costs, framing it not as a request but as an obligation. Family helps family, and I said no, clearly and calmly the first time they asked. And I want to walk through what happened after that no, because the no was not the interesting part of this story. The 6 months of silence that followed was, I had said no once, directly in a phone call, explaining that I had been saving for years toward a specific goal, and that $45,000 represented a significant portion of a down payment I had been building for nearly a decade. And my mother's response to that no was not to accept it. It was to escalate. And over the following 2 weeks, she called 4 more times, each call slightly more emotional than the last, framing my refusal as selfishness. Then as a betrayal of Brianna specifically, then, in the final call, as evidence that I had always considered myself better than the rest of the family because of my financial discipline, and my father got involved as well, sending a long text message that said things like, "We sacrificed for you growing up, and this is how you repay that, and you'll have plenty of time to save for a house later. Your sister only gets married once." And I read every message, and I did not respond to any of them with further explanation, because I had already explained myself clearly the first time, and continuing to explain felt like it was teaching them that pressure eventually produces a different answer, which is exactly the lesson I did not want them learning. So I stopped responding entirely, not as punishment, but as a boundary. And I want to be precise about that distinction because it matters. I did not block my parents. I did not make a dramatic announcement that I was cutting them off. I simply stopped initiating contact and stopped responding to messages that pushed on the same topic. And when they called, I let it go to voicemail. And I did not listen to most of the voicemails because I could generally tell from the first few seconds whether it was going to be another version of the same pressure. And this went on for 6 months, through Brianna's bridal shower, which I did not attend, through a family Easter gathering, which I skipped, through what I understand was a significant amount of family discussion about my behavior that I was not present for and largely did not hear about until much later. During those 6 months, I want to be honest about what I actually did, because I think it matters more than the silence itself, which is that I continued exactly as planned. I kept saving. I closed on a house 4 months into the silence, a modest 2-bedroom property that represented 8 years of careful financial decisions finally paying off. And I moved in quietly, told almost no one in my extended family, and continued living my life without the wedding conflict occupying any further space in my attention. And I want to be clear that this was not me thriving spitefully or performing happiness at them. It was simply me removing an exhausting recurring conflict from my life and replacing that space with something I had actually been working toward. Brianna's wedding happened during this 6-month silence, and I did not attend, which I know sounds harsh stated plainly like that, and I want to address it honestly. I had told Brianna directly, separately from the conflict with my parents, that I loved her and supported her marriage, and that my conflict was specifically with our parents' demand for my savings, not with her wedding itself, and I had offered, before any of the escalation happened, a genuine and meaningful contribution within what I felt was reasonable, several $1,000s towards something specific like her dress or the flowers, an offer my parents had dismissed as insulting compared to what they actually wanted. And Brianna, to her credit, had told me quietly during one of the only conversations we had during those 6 months that she understood, and that she wished our parents had not put her in the middle of it. And that conversation, more than anything else, is what eventually led to the silence ending. It was Brianna, 6 months after the wedding, who called me and asked if we could talk. Not about money, just talk, and I said yes, and we met for coffee, just the two of us. And she told me that our parents had spent the wedding planning period and the months after telling extended family a version of events where I had selfishly abandoned the family over money. And that version had circulated widely enough that several relatives had reached out to her with concern about me. Not concern about the actual situation, just concern shaped by the narrative our parents had been telling. And Brianna said, I think you should know what they've been saying, because I don't think it's fair to you. And I thanked her for telling me. And I asked her if she would be willing to be in the room if I finally had a real conversation with our parents. Not as a mediator, just as a witness to an accurate version of events. And she agreed. The conversation happened 3 weeks later at Brianna's apartment, which I chose specifically because it was neutral ground. Not their house, not mine. And my parents arrived expecting, I think, an apology or at least a softened version of me ready to explain myself further. And instead I sat down and said, I want to walk through exactly what happened over the past 6 months, because I understand a version of this has been circulating that doesn't match what actually occurred. And my mother said, Hannah, we don't need to relitigate this. And I said, I think we do. Because you've apparently been telling people I abandoned this family over money, when what actually happened is I said no once, clearly, to a financial demand I felt was unreasonable, and you spent 2 weeks escalating that no into accusations of selfishness and betrayal. And when I stopped engaging with that pressure, I wasn't punishing anyone. I was protecting a boundary you refused to respect the first time I stated it. My father said you can't just disappear on your family, Hannah. And I said I didn't disappear. I removed myself from a conversation I had already answered honestly, and you chose not to hear the answer, and the room was quiet. And my mother said we just wanted you to be there for your sister. And I said I offered to be there for her in a way that felt sustainable to me. And you rejected that offer because it wasn't the specific amount you wanted. And that's not the same as me not wanting to be there for Brianna. And Brianna, sitting quietly until this point, said, Mom, Dad, she's right. You made this about the money specifically, not about whether she loved me or supported me. And that distinction sat in the room for a long moment. And my mother, finally, said, I think we owe you an apology for how this was handled. And I said, I appreciate that. And I want you to understand that the silence wasn't cruelty. It was the only tool I had left once direct conversation stopped being respected. We talked for almost 2 hours that afternoon, the most honest conversation my parents and I have had in years. And I did not give them the $45,000. The house remains mine fully and completely. And what changed was not the money. It was the understanding between us that a clear no, stated once calmly, is supposed to be enough. And that escalating past, that no does not eventually produce a different answer. It simply produces distance. And I think my parents finally understand that distinction now, 6 months and one difficult conversation later. And Brianna and I are closer than we have ever been, partly because that conversation forced an honesty between all of us that years of polite avoidance never could have produced. And I do not regret the silence even now, because some boundaries only become real to the people testing them once they experience exactly what happens when you actually hold one.